All right, folks. Let's just get this over with so we can have lunch.
Priorities, I guess.
That's right. So when Michelle asked me what I'd like to speak of, I just did what every good presenter does, which is give a title that sounds very meaningful that means nothing. So we were going to talk about scholarship in action, which some of you, I don't know if you've gotten the official propaganda machine yet, but this is actually Syracuse University's theme at this point. The chancellor has said we are now dedicated to scholarship in action, which is the idea that you do good scholarship, yes, but that it has to have an impact. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what I perceive as a real important part of what we do, and frankly that you guys in the Exec Doc program probably represent better than any other scholar that are in this building right now, and that's the idea that work we do has impact. So we started talking yesterday about the idea that part of doctoral education is changing how you think, right? So we're messing with your mind. And what I want to make sure of is that we complete that cycle, which is you're going to learn a lot of things that are how research should be. And you're going to be filled up with a lot of, and by the way, the slides will be available, and if I get this right, there'll be a screencast as well. So if you ever want to see it again, you can. What we do with a lot of coursework in doctoral preparation is we teach you to be really worried. We teach you to be really worried about things that you may not have been worried about before. Validity, reliability, what's your empirical data, what's your argument. I heard a little bit coming on the tail end. So what? What does it matter? How do you know? Came up in this, right? And those are really important questions. But I would say that the so what question is the most important one. So this is a picture. I was just in Rome. The volcano could not stop me. And I was so excited when I found this picture, and I took this picture, and my wife was like, yeah, why? You know, you got one with freckles and one without. But as a huge fan of Renaissance art, this is the before picture and this is the after picture. When you were working with an expensive piece of marble, particularly if it's really big, you didn't just start with a chisel and hammer and go at it. What you would start with is plaster, because plaster is cheap, and if you make a mistake, you can just add more plaster to it. So you would do a plaster cast. And then embedded into the plaster cast, you would put all of these points. Actually, the next picture shows it a little bit more clearly. You would put all of these points. These are like little nails that they've put in. And the idea is you would then have a set of calipers with you so that you could, when you're working on the actual piece of marble, you could go and see how close you are and such. Now, this was particularly useful when you were scaling up because you could have a piece of calipers that would go from here to here. And so you could make very large sculptures based on a really small model. The reason I bring this up is that a lot of what doctoral education about is having you figure out where those points are. And the whole point of this system is so that you can replicate this. In fact, I was on a tour, I was in Florence a couple years ago, and they were doing a tour, and they were saying, you know, showing off this thing and saying, this is the problem. And then they'd show you another, you know, gorgeous piece of work, and this is the problem. And you weren't quite sure if you were listening in English because you were looking at this going, and what's the problem here? Right. I walked into this enormous room, it's in the academy where they have the David, and along the ceiling they had rows and rows and rows of busts. And what they said is, the bottom row are the masters, and everyone else is basically their senior thesis. They had to do their bust, and they had to be as good as the masters before they could leave, right? And the problem was that you could no longer tell the difference between the students and the masters because what this whole system was set up to do was to build you to the point and no further than and no variance from the masters. And it led to stagnation in Renaissance art where it took the Germans with expressionism and stuff to finally break away from this near photographic movement. And if we do our job poorly, what we give you is the skill to make this beautiful system which is as good as me or good as Michelle. It creates clones. We don't want to do that. We want to create scholars that can truly go in and innovate and have impact and come up with new ideas. So what I would like to do is just briefly walk you through a way of building an agenda, demonstrate the limitations about how that agenda can and cannot work, and then show you some examples of how you could use theory to move beyond just what you can see. So I was working with the second cohort yesterday, so really quickly. When you're coming up with an agenda, what you want to do is you want to start with the situation that you want to solve, right? The question that you want to solve. What's the area that wakes you up at night? What's that question that concerns you? So in my case, early on in my career, it was virtual reference. It was how can people answer questions online, right? So this had impact with federal STI. It had impact with lots of libraries, virtual reference, digital reference, impact in the support industry. And so what do we do to know about what's happening now? We usually do something called a lit review, where you go in and you look at what everyone else is studying, what everyone else is thinking. You look at Gartner group reports, you look at statistics, you benchmark, you find out what's happening today. And then what I think we're really good at teaching in most doctoral education is predicting the future. I'm not saying that we make you really good at predicting the future, but this is really the assumption. What are the underlying causes for that? What are the independent and dependent variables? How can I account for variability in here? What's the theory that's driving this factor, right? And so what we hope to do within doctoral education is to get you out of my gut tells me and get you into, well, the data tells me, the theory tells me, this method tells me this is where we're headed. So if there's no change, we're going here. And I would argue that a lot of what we do in doctoral education is really good at getting us to this line. The problem with this line is, the example I give, it's kind of like having customer satisfaction surveys on the deck of the Titanic, which is you may get really valid data. Well, how did you feel? It was great, the wine was good, not so happy about the iceberg. Anyway, you get all this wonderful data that you can really feel confident about how these people are feeling while they're drowning. But it's not helpful, it's not useful, right? What happens if you don't like where things are headed? And my guess is, particularly in your profession, particularly coming back to it, you're doing this because you want to change. That when you have a question, the question isn't, gee, why is it like this? But more often it's like, why isn't it like this? And so ultimately what we need to get to is our ideal future. What do we want to happen? Now, this is where we typically beat the testosterone out of people. And so every doctoral student I've ever talked to, when they wrote their thesis, when they wrote the proposal, the first draft, it was always like, this is why it's like that, this is what it will be, in very definitive verbs and such. And then they always in the last draft go back and go, might, should, kinda, could, right? Just let me waffle a little bit here because I don't want to be held to this one. And between that ideal future and that predicted future will be a gap. That gap could be tiny, that gap could be tremendous, right? And the other thing that I get from a lot of folks is, okay, how do I develop an agenda? Which is, yes, I'm going to get this thesis done, but how do I turn that into the next study, the next opportunity, the next investigation, the next whatever? And it's only in this gap that you find the next question. Because then what you can do is you can work backwards, and you can begin to say, well, if we're here, and I think we're going here, what are the steps that I need to put in place to get me there? And those steps aren't necessarily more studies, though they can be. In a traditional scholarly system, the idea is, as my understanding goes, I collect more data, I do more sites, I do more studies, right? So Michelle was talking about this is a one-site study. Great, I have this, I can take it to another site, then I can do it longitudinally, then I can do, right? So I can increase my understanding until I get this. But what I think is increasingly important, and very, very important, and why I'm thrilled that we have an exec doctoral program, is that often those tasks may have nothing to do with research and studies and data, and everything to do with how you present them and what other things you do. So early on, my area of research was in virtual reference, how people answer questions. And so we were at a situation starting around 92 where people said, in a library context, you can't answer questions online. Reference is a face-to-face thing. That when someone walks into a library, they have to walk into a library to answer their question. Why? Because I have to see them. I have to see their body language. I have to see all this other stuff. I have to go back and forth really quickly. And in 92, there wasn't a lot of back and forth going on the internet at this point. Right? So it can't be done. Now, we were doing some of this in email, and so we said, yeah, it can. So if that sort of thing prevailed within libraries, the predicted future was we would see a marginal search. We would see this marginalization of reference as a small niche service. That as people were going on the internet, getting more information, doing more self-help, finding, this is before the days of Google Answers and Yahoo Answers, but there were equivalents of out there. There was a whole field of these things called ASCA services. They got their name from things like Ask a Librarian, but also Ask a Volcanologist. My favorite was not Ask Shamu. That was a good one. It's a really good one. My favorite was Ask the Amish, which was an email reference service for the Amish. Now, take a moment on that one. It was actually run by like the Mennonite Center across the street. I think they like got the questions, printed them out, walked her over, said, "How do you churn butter?" and came back. But there were all these services blowing up all over the place, and the idea was that people, when they had a question, were thinking, well, if I want to know about volcanoes, I'm going to ask a volcanologist before I'm going to ask a librarian, even though the librarian probably is better able to answer your specific question, because the volcanologists get really tired of answering what is the difference between lava and magma. One's above ground, one's below. Anyway, so what this turned into was a series of agendas. The first was to identify benchmarks. So what is good service? Can we do this online? How do we do this? How do we perform it? Research study. The second thing is, as we went out and told people this is a cool thing and you should be doing it, they kept coming back going, how do I do it? How do I do it? How do I do it? And so we needed to provide tools, in this case software tools. And this is one of the things that I've done, your comment about as you go through your position with the other folks you're working with, suddenly that shift changed. I very much appreciate that. And one of the things that we found is, I had all this wonderful research and data and said, this is how we should do it and why we should do it. And I go to librarians and it's like, this is why you should do it. And they look at me and go, how? And I say, well, build a piece of software. And they go, stop, you're done. I can't build that software. I can't do this, right? This happens all the time in library land, but I'm sure it happens in other contexts, which is like, go do a survey and see what those people think. Do a survey? Now the problem is everyone thinks they can do a survey and then they can't, right? So, oh, SurveyMonkey, it's free. Click, 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 click. And they construct something, they get the data back, and like, I don't know what to do with this data. I don't know what's meaningful, what's not meaningful. Does this truly represent things? And so we need to provide systems. Those systems don't necessarily have to be technical systems, though in our field they tend to be. They can be administrative systems, they can be evaluative systems, they can be workshops and workbooks, they can be routinized systems. Kurt Lewin, the sociologist who does a lot of work on change, came up with something called the force field model. And in change management, he says, look, you have organizations that are frozen. People who do what they do, they've always done it, and they don't want to move. That we look at it as a really negative way. But they live in a routinized world because if everything is questioned, everything's in change, it's hard to get something productive done. It says the problem is to get them to a new future state, this ideal state, you have to unfreeze them. And there are two ways to unfreeze them. You can, one, make them feel really good about where they're going, but equally important, you've got to make them feel really bad about where they are. And in certain settings, librarians are really good about making them feel good about where they are and really bad about feeling, oh, that's mean and nasty. And we've all been in works where it's reversed. They're really good about making me feel bad. I wish they'd tell me where we're going. And that once you get them unfrozen, they enter into a necessary point of turbulence. That change is always turbulent. There is always upsetness around change. And you must refreeze them. And that means you need to provide them with new routines. So the classic one is, we're moving to this new management scheme. All right, who do I report to? What's my evaluation? What are my outputs? How am I going to be determined? If we don't have, we'll figure that out. What happens is people, unfrozen, will seek out a new frozen state, and it's almost always what they just came from. So unless you give them the tools, technical tools, hardware tools, software tools, conceptual tools, evaluative tools, they'll move back. So we need to build systems. The next thing is building a movement, which is oftentimes having a group of people do this rather than just you do it is much more helpful. So you need to have the team around you. This is management 101. I'm sure I'm not telling you all this other stuff. But in research, the same thing is true. If you have a new idea, you need the masses to adopt it. All too often, doctoral level research can lead to the individual genius model. Point to you. Thank you. You're welcome. Right? And that is, this is your area. There's a classic sort of academic, it's based on an academic model which goes something like divide pond till biggest fish within you are, right? So, I don't just do library science because everyone does library science. I do reference, and I don't just do reference, I do digital reference. And I don't, too many people. I do systems of digital, too many people. I do Commodore 64's use in, And so the idea is to keep moving it to you're the most special person in the world. The problem with that is, as you get more and more cloistered in your area, it becomes harder and harder for people not only to evaluate it, but to add to it, to connect to it, to enrich the work you do. And so one of the necessary things you need to do is you need to look at what's that movement. Where are my compatriots in my staff, outside of my staff, in academia? Where is my invisible college, as it were? And then in virtual reference, identify quality, which is really new benchmarks, new standards. How do we know we're doing it? Now, how did we do this? One, we looked at the literature going on in the field. The literature in the field of reference in libraries was a lot of, this book's good, this book's bad. I mean, it was very about materials. Reference was defined as stuff. And what we did is we had a concerted effort where we got myself and some other academics, we picked a journal, Reference and User Services Quarterly, and said, we're going to turn them. And so we got editorial positions on it, we bombarded them with articles, we gave them, because Michelle's absolutely right, there's all this pressure to get published in these, but the other thing that they don't tell you is that journal editors are always desperate to get things published. So there's this really interesting dynamic going, particularly at the B level. And so we took this one over and changed it. The other thing we got to this is we set up an international conference. So we had 7 annual conferences for people to come and talk about it. Because what happened was, in 8 years, we were able to talk about virtual reference from kinda to, if you have a library that's not doing it, they're the odd duck. And it turned by finding, sort of building the army of the willing, giving them the tools, software, and giving them forum to come in and talk about it. You see this in lots of different settings. Murali Venkatesh on our faculty tells that when he was at Indiana University and he wanted to get, his school wanted to have a lot more people working in the area of sort of telecommunications systems. And so what they did is they started a summer camp for academics where they would bring academics in and they would teach them all the methods and things like that and give them a free publishing venue to work in and convert them over. So what is it that if you want to get this research thought about, you need to sort of walk through some of these steps? This is the one we did for virtual reference. And the lessons we learned was the difference between the content of research and the business of research. This is more of an academic side. Once again, you guys are probably much more familiar with this than this side. In academia, it's the opposite. So the importance of tools, you have to have it. Now you have a so what question. You may understand that, but if you can't hand it to people who didn't go through your degree to figure it out, it's not going to work so well. Build on existing communities. You know, look for those groups that are already there in need of direction. And then build zip cords between the towers and the trenches. And that's the idea that academics and practitioners need to commingle in these spaces. One of my favorite quotes, let's see, to practice without theory is to set sail without a map. Theory without practice is never to set sail at all. You need the two things jointly combined. So the reason, if I jump back to this, I can say, oh, well, Dave, you know, you did it. You said, you know, this is a model. You've identified what happened, and great, you did this with virtual reference. But actually, I bring this up in the whole virtual reference because it turns out I didn't. It turns out that underneath all of this wonderful political process, the intellectual drivers and models were still very descriptive. So I want to just walk you through what I mean by that. So this is where I started. So I don't blame the field, I blame myself. And this is a very, very broad framework. Comes out of something called complex adaptive systems, complexity theory, really fun. And it goes something like this. In an environment, you have an agent. Think of it as an organization, as an individual, something like that, right? So in a library, you have a librarian. In this case, it was in the internet, you have one of these digital reference services. That agent has what it knows about the world, detectors. In general systems theory, it's called input, process, output. So what does it know from its own staff? How does it listen to its own staff? Does it have meetings on a regular basis? How does it inform itself? What does it do to listen to sort of things outside of the internet? This was very much about building and maintaining an internet service. So what's outside of the internet? Policy, regulations, rules, and regs. What does it know about its users? What does it know about service providers? What does it know about applications, infrastructures, etc.? So what does it sort of pay attention to? What's its eyes and ears? Once it gets that data, what rules does it use to process that data? And resources are things that you can physically look. What are the IT systems? What are the policies and manuals, etc.? And then finally, effectors, which is how does it then try and shape the environment of which is full of all these other agents. All right? Now, the reason this model comes out of complexity theory is, one, I really like complexity theory. I love it. The problem is that up to that point, complexity theory has always been about simulations. Meaning, oh, we have a complex, we can identify a complex environment, the stock market, biological systems, etc. And we can use these rules to create sort of genetic algorithms to go and simulate them. So we can try and figure out what are the major factors that leads to stock market performance. But it's very descriptive. I wanted to take it and apply it to how we actually build services. So I went and talked to a bunch of these virtual reference services that I thought were successful and refined this model into this, right? That says, okay, really not a lot of listening internally. They all had parent organizations. They were really only knew about users by the questions they asked. They did a lot of web surfing. They read a lot of publications, and they had no idea what infrastructure was out there. They didn't actually pay for it. They got a question in. It would figure out how to best answer it. They would generate an answer to the user, and they would track them over time for more. I can make this look a little prettier. And I magically called this the general digital reference model. Right? So a user asks a question. We figure out how we're going to answer it. Either we send it to a specific person, it goes into a big pool, whatever it is. The expert then picks up that question, formulates an answer, sends it to the user. There's tracking, which leads to an archive, and potentially secondary resource creation. So far, so good? And then, because I had to get tenure, I made it look even prettier. And so this was, there's that general digital reference model, but now we've done a quality study with lots of libraries paying into it. And so now I could tell you, for example, tracking, what are the criteria they use for tracking? How do we evaluate the appropriateness of user questions? We started building ISO standards, all this other stuff put together in a magic box. Looking back now, there are two fundamental problems with this model. The first, and it works perfectly, but there's a hidden assumption. There's a hidden assumption in this model. What's that?
That it's a good answer?
Nope, we have quality criteria all over.
Okay.
That was earlier. We assumed that a lot, but yeah.
Things stay the same.
A lot of that. But the hidden one here is one user, one expert, one answer. Right? Because that's how reference was set up. So when I went and interviewed reference services and said, how do you do it? They said, user asks a question, expert provides an answer. Well, when you look at the increasing social nature of the internet, that kind of model goes poof, which is, it's not that this model is wrong. It's just that it now works in a much more limited sense than what we know is possible. And this model doesn't in any way predict the larger social poof problem. Because the other problem with this model is it's descriptive. Ultimately, this is where I started with. These are the pins in the plaster cast. It tells me what's there. It doesn't tell me where to go next. So while I showed you this nice little, oh, it's the agenda and everything, the actual underlying intellectual core models being developed were descriptive. They at best could tell you what is and what was. They couldn't really tell you what should be, where it should go. All right? And so this makes sense because it's empirical, because how do you get data on things that don't exist? It makes sense because it is theoretical in the sense that it conforms to a theory, though it may not be very inclusive theory. So this sort of feels and smells like we can do validity and reliability, and it's empirical, and that's what a research paper is. The problem is it doesn't tell you where to go next. And so I had this conversation, and in fact, once again, Michelle just mentioned, there's some papers, both of them will be mine, that have no data in them.
I have a few of those too.
Okay, yeah, right. And in fact, it turns out that those seminal papers that people tend to point to aren't exclusively, but a lot of them are non-empirical papers because they're talking about logic and theory. Yeah.
But to me, that's really important because it's that idea of understanding what is current reality, so that you can to really understand this.
Once again, well, I got tenure. It worked.
It's an important reality.
Right. This is not. My point of this isn't that this is unimportant. My point of this isn't that it's not valid. My point of it is to make sure that you're understanding that the push and drive and concerns, that questions that we're going to ask and push you in this program are going to push you to description. They're going to push you to empirical, right? What's the first two courses that you're going to take in methodology? Statistics. Statistics only work if you have data. How do you, if you don't have data, you can't do stats on it. So those are some things to think about. So it's important work, and it's not useless work, and a lot of people can make an entire career out of it. My point is to start thinking, well, wait, where can we go next? And so where we can go next, and what I started thinking about is, all right, what's going on here? How can I figure out what's next? Now, I'm still working in the library context, but the problem with working in a library context is having a theory of libraries, and there have been attempts, is a lot like having a theory of General Motors. It doesn't make sense. Right? They're artificial creations. Right? God did not sneeze and a library fell down. Right? These things we make. But really, would you want to be coming from a sneeze? I mean, the other side of that. Right? And so a lot of these ideas are, we need to look at something more fundamental, something lower, something more basic. And so looking around, where I ended up was something called conversation theory. And conversation theory is actually a learning theory. It comes out of cybernetics. And it says, how do people learn? And the answer that conversation theory says is, at the base, people learn through conversations. Now, let's talk a little bit what it is, and we'll start with Bob here. So Bob is got a question, as represented by the hole in Bob's head. Bob comes from two sources. One, Mike Nyland always uses a character named Bob, and so I picked it up. And this also refers back to Bob Taylor, who's a former dean here, and developed something called question negotiation. And what he said was that when you have a question, it goes through all these stages. And it starts with what he calls the unstated need. Taylor 68, question negotiation, read it, most brilliant article ever written out of the school, including and especially mine. He said it starts with basically you don't even know you have the question. It's like a nagging feeling. It's like you're walking around with this general discontent. And then you begin to formulate the question. And you eventually come up with something called a compromise need. And the compromise need is, it's hard to come up with a question. Because think about what a question is. It's an articulation of something you don't know. This is why, for example, every question-answer service, commercial question-answer service ever developed has failed miserably, including Google Answers, including Yahoo Answers. There were many people in the virtual reference desk that said, $5 for an easy question, $10 for a hard question. To me, it's an easy question, right? To me, it's a hard question, right? If I ask you something like, what's my social security number? Right? To me, it's a very easy thing to answer. I'm hoping to you it's a very hard thing to answer, right? And it gets worse, right? So if I ask something like, what's the volume of air necessary to keep the dome aloft? To me, that's a hard question. To the structural engineers put up, it's an easy question. But I don't know that. And so librarian after librarian will tell you that what a patron thinks is an easy question turns out to take them 3 days. And what the patron thinks is a hard question takes them 10 seconds. Right? And Google screwed up this equation because now they've taken all the easy ones away. Most insulting question a reference librarian can ever ask another human being. Well, have you looked in Google? Well, duh. Why would I be here? So you have this sort of nagging question. Now, where does that question come from? It comes from two sources. It comes from what you already know, what you've already experienced, and it comes from some sort of motivation to find an answer. And that motivation can be intrinsic, in which the reward for the answer will be self-generated. I just got to know this. Or extrinsic, in which the reward for the answer will come externally. You've got to answer this if you want your bonus, if you want to get your pay, if you want to keep your job, etc. So what happens is, when this question becomes actionable, you're going to explore a domain of knowledge over time. And over time, how you view the world, how you know things, which is a uniquely human experience, will change. I told you it's basic. And how do we do that? Well, we engage in a series of conversations. Those conversations can be with colleagues, those conversations can be friends. 99.9% of the conversations we'll have are with ourselves. We'll have internal dialogues. I don't know, we didn't get to this level, but we were talking about reading. Reading is an internal dialogue. You're literally having two voices talking to you going to do. Right? If you just sat there and said, what the hell is he talking about? Who were you talking to? Right? If you woke up this morning and said, does this shirt make me look fat? If there was no one else in the room, who were you talking to? Right? We do this. We have internal dialogues all the time. And so what we do is we have all these conversations. Now the conversations, which by the way is it's a mutable idea. can have conversations within yourself. An organization can have a conversation with another organization. A country can have it with another country. A society can have it with another society. So it's a scalable idea. Is we're exchanging language back and forth. So language goes back and forth. And what we're seeking to do out of this language is we're seeking to come to agreements. Now, agreements are not the same thing as facts. Agreements are, first of all, things that are going to change our behavior. It's a nice day outside. It's not a nice day. Politic good, politic bad, hot, cold, etc., etc. These are agreements. And these agreements, what's even more important about these agreements is that they are in relation to one another. So let's do a quick, silly, stupid word game. Ready? I'm going to give you a word. You think of the definition. Ready? Light. L-I-G-H-T. Show of hands. How many people thought illumination? Not heavy. Set ablaze. Good, no pyromaniacs in the room. Now, those all made sense, right? I mean, when I give them to her. Next one. Formula. Formula. Mathematical combination. Chemical combination. Things you give a baby to keep it from starving to death. All right? Grandparent? Right.
Not me.
No. So, once again, they all make sense. It's just, last one. And actually, I'm going to give you the answer for this one. OMG. I'm guessing you didn't think Omni Media Group.
No.
I'm guessing you didn't think of object metadata is something or other. I'm guessing you thought, oh my God, right? Not only can I guess what you meant, but I can also guess that you either think about texting or IM. Now, why is that? Because the first one I couldn't predict. If you look at those hands, they were relatively random. Because your brain has lots of agreements around this word light. It knows all of those made sense. Formula, all those made sense. And they're used so much, they're so common, that your brain just sort of randomly jumps to one. Unless I put a picture of a light bulb up here and say, light, you would go, oh, illumination. OMG, you have very, very, very few mental connections to, and they're very strong. Right? So the idea is that these things are in relation to it. Right? So the fact that Mount Everest is this high is one agreement. The fact that your airplane can only fly this high is another agreement. But it's the relationship between the two, like I want to fly this plane over this mountain, that becomes very important. All right, with me so far. A couple other things about agreements. Agreements can have a relationship to where you learned them, either to another conversant, oh, I learned this when I talked to, or an artifact, oh, I read this in, but that these things will over time disappear, that your brain will keep the agreement and very rarely keep the source. It's called source amnesia. So if I asked you, what are clouds made out of? You would probably say something like water vapor. If I asked you how you know that, you would say, I learned it sometime. Or better, in school.
Right.
When? What day? Who's the teacher? No idea. Unless, of course, it was like one of those teachers that did something really cool, like they jumped a drug of water and you remembered that situation. And in fact, your brain, it's even worse than that. That neurological studies show that when I ask you to recall an agreement, your brain literally recreates the agreement. And that's why it doesn't always do it very well. So the classic thing about political dialogue and rumors is that if you are ever accused of something, David Lankus plagiarized an article, I should never get up and say, I did not plagiarize that article. Because your brain starts remembering, it just got not plagiarized, article, plagiarized, article. It eventually forgets the not part, and your brain just starts settling it in. And you don't remember any source of the conversation to go and see it again. This is why one of the roles of librarians is memory. So what we have here is now something much more fundamental that we can start building theories on. So I'll recall, we started with virtual reference as a very descriptive. What are people doing? How are they doing it? How can we optimize the system? What's the state of the system? What's the relation to the system? Right? Empirical, theoretical, valid, lovely. What can we do with this much more fundamental theory is we can go in and we can begin to re-examine things like credibility. Because in essence, these agreements represent what you will find credible. So when we look at credibility, we know a couple things about credibility. We know the first thing is, in given short-term credibility decisions, like you bring up a web page and I ask you credible or not credible, you will make that determination within less than a second. And you will base it on two things. First thing you will base it on, is it pretty? Swear to God. The more professional it looks, the more you're likely to believe it. And that's a huge, overwhelming, if you want to learn about regression analysis, that's the big variable. And the second thing is, do you already believe it? So why do some people watch Fox News and some people watch MSNBC? Because they keep hearing things they already agree because they find it more credible. If I tell you things that don't make sense, you reject them. And it turns out that that happens in all sorts of things. I mean, you know, it's night outside. You look at me and go, that's not a credible statement. Lots of evidence. But if I say things like Syracuse is cold in the winter, or better yet, Seattle is always cloudy. It turns out Syracuse has fewer sunny days than Seattle does. Right? But that's not what you sort of already have been led to believe. So, looking at credibility, the question that we began to operationalize in a study that literally started yesterday was, how can we make it easier to find credible information on the internet? Now, if I look at our old model of virtual reference, it doesn't answer that question because it just describes how we answer things. It doesn't describe how we think. Looking at this, life changes. So let's start with the idea that we're going to have librarians over here and a patron user over here. We already have some data that shows that, first of all, librarians are seen as very credible people by a large population. If I were to ask you credible populations, librarians, the majority of you would say, yes, they're credible people, regardless of data. Okay? The other thing we know is that how can we take this and grab it? Well, the first thing we've learned from the first study is that we have lots of answers to questions going on online. Librarians are answering questions. We have data that shows that if you look at a bunch of websites and I tell you they come from librarians, you will find those websites more credible regardless of whether they actually did or did not come from librarians. So, the thing is, we're going to go ahead and take all those millions of questions that these librarians are answering, pull all the URLs out of them, and allow patrons to search them. With me so far? The idea being that now, when you search online, what you hit comes from a librarian, you will perceive it as more credible. Well, we started evolving this idea based on how people think. And we said, well, the first thing is, librarians provide a lot more stuff than just URLs. So for example, yes, they provide links to web pages, but they're also pointing to things like books. They're also pointing to things like music. They're pointing to all sorts of materials going in. And we can capture those, including people. And now, drawing from our theory of how we think, not only do we have the stuff in here, but we have the relationships going on as well. This connected to this, this led to this. This question led to this answer. For example, if you go into Google and you put in the word running, will you find things on running as a sport or running a business? Right? It's an ambiguous query. I actually don't know what you'll find. So what we can do now is we sort of say, all right, we have reference librarians creating this collection of stuff, and we can then provide some interfaces. So let me make this a little bit more generic. We have information coming from credible resource environments, things that you trust, librarians, but eventually other folks. And we can serve those credibility determinations out into some sort of use environment. How do we serve them? Well, we know from good technology sense that we serve them by creating a sort of API so they can be mashed into lots of stuff, which is we don't have to just build a search engine. We can build results that can be ingested into Google. So Google could bring up their search results and highlight these are more credible than others. Barnes & Noble could bring it in and say, well, these books were librarian recommended. We can do lots of things like that. So we can serve it out with an API. We can also then become a little bit more sophisticated about this credible use environment. So we have not only reference librarians answering questions, we can grab it from the Internet Public Library, or IPL2. We can grab it from other services. We can grab their books and materials. But we can also talk about from a medical or journalist setting. Right? So we can say, well, what do doctors find credible with health information? What do nurses find credible with health information? Because if we can build the system for reference librarians, we can extend the same architecture to other populations. And once again, we can serve it out to lots of different places. So let me just drill in on this collection thing for a moment. So we have these items, and we know these items are things like who asked the question, who answered and provided the resource, what was the relationships. And this provides us a few things. The first thing it provides us in relation to existing search technology is that current search technology is built on a web page points to a web page, simply called topology. This is how Google works, this is how Bing works, all these other things. The problem is that this is actually a limiting factor. which is what happens when you point to things that aren't web page-like. You go, hey, anything can be described in a web page. But library catalog records don't fit very well in this. X-ray images don't fit in very well because there's not a lot of data to work on. The truth is that these search engines are working on the text in here. The images are blind to them. I mean, if you do an image search, all it's doing is looking for the right keywords and pulling the closest associated image to it. So we can already take one step ahead by talking about, in this starting with, a librarian points to a web page. But we also have said that a librarian can point to any sort of web addressable object. And we want to get to the point where a credible agent points to a web addressable object. So this is a doctor, this is a journalist, but eventually these are my friends on Facebook. This is my brother and sister. This is my, whatever it is. We can build these internal networks of credibility. What we can do with that is we can also, since we have this relationship, is we can begin saying, well, this is the explicit relationships, but we know that there's an implied relationship, which is if this web page was credible, maybe the site on which the web page sits is credible. And what we can imagine now is creating a sort of scalable index of high credibility, low number of resources, but being able to scale out and say, well, we can keep going to low assurance of credibility, lots and lots of resources, and have a sort of credibility ranking. Right? We talked about the API briefly, but let me give you some other examples here. So we can take this and we can build a search interface, YiHa, where you put in a term, it brings back the results. You can see all the words that may be associated with it. You can see how many times it was referenced. You can even drill down into who referenced it. So you can begin to say, I don't find this credible, so anyone who referenced this, I don't want to hear from them anymore. Right? You can begin to see, here's that ranking of high credibility, low number of resources. So you can build a search engine, but it gets even more fun because you can also talk about embedding it right in other services. So let's take that back to where we started with virtual reference, which is, here's a very simple interface where someone's going to log in and ask a librarian a question, simple chat interface. And so what happens is, as the user inputs their question, we can, in real time, bundle up that question, jump it off to what we're calling our credibility engine, let it churn on those keywords, and pump back a series of resources and populate this pane. And then what can happen, we'll give them some simple things so that the librarian can say, more like this, not this one's more useful than that one, kind of stuff. But the librarian can very quickly say, oh, don't want that one, but this one will answer it, boom, send back the answer, reference is over. Now this is a really bad reference interview. It should be an interview. And so what we really need is things like, as we get more information, we should continually refine these things. So as this happens, you'll notice these resources have changed. Let me do the instant replay here. As the user's typing in more meaty keywords, these resources become refined in real time. Right? And all this refinement is coming from those connections from credible sources. And at the end of this transaction, what we end up with is a relationship between a credible agent, the person who asked the question, and the resources. We have a conversation. We have a conversation with a series of agreements that are mapped together. We can take and bundle that map up, and because we know it came from a credible agent, we can use it to expand and enhance that collection over time. So the more this is used, the more powerful this inference engine becomes.
Images, it looks like you're almost extracting these credible resources into a separate subset somewhere that you can go and search. I guess my question is, let's say I'm a librarian, you're a doctor, and I give you a credibility key. You've been granted a license.
Right.
I'm just thinking, rather than extract it out to somewhere else, why not, I give it semantic web, why not let me tag what's already coming up in Google? Google is doing all the hard work.
Right.
I apply my credibility
Right.
to that source, but use the power of Google
Yep.
to bring it, use a search engine to bring it to the top,
Yep.
put it together in their APIs. So I guess I'm trying to understand, why would you want to extract it out
Right.
as credible, but just leave it there and tag it as credible?
A couple of reasons. One, in that little interview I showed, those resources, they may say, oh, it's not there, I'm going to go search Google. They may add resources from outside of this source. That's how this thing expands as well. All right? Second is, we want all of these different layers disconnected. So this might be Google generating the search among these things. It's actually going to be a semantic web technology. And the reason you have to extract it is just because semantic web is delightful, but it requires things like RDF descriptions, and it requires the database systems underneath it. So in terms of providing search. In a second, I'm going to show you how we can push it into other settings, which is what we started with this project was we're going to build a search engine, and what we heard back was why would you want to build a search engine, right? And so the answer is why I brought up that little Rex search engine that had those. Google could have been embedding them next to it as well. We see that. And one of the things, the reason that we're pushing the extraction as opposed to just hosting it within Google and such, when Bing came out, Bing was the first search engine that took away market share from Google. The way it took away market share from Google wasn't just because it was brilliant and had a good ad campaign. Is the same day Microsoft pushed an update to the Windows operating system that set all the default search engines in Internet Explorer to Bing. There is a lot of discussion about how suddenly everyone who had paid and search engine optimized to be at the top of Google results wasn't, right? And what that said for credibility was, gee, exactly, is Google optimizing for credibility and assuredness, or is there other stuff that Google might be optimizing for? And so taking this out of the argument, this is a MacArthur-funded project. And the reason we're making an argument to MacArthur is part of credibility is to be a trusted third-party source.
Now, you need an API into Google. See,
Right.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, Google custom searches, you can build these subsets yourself.
Yep.
But I'm thinking if Google gave you the API to pull out
Yep.
what you tagged,
Yep.
and you don't have.
Right, absolutely, yes. So, but let me go one step further. So that was a sort of reference assistant. But imagine what we started thinking about, once again, fundamentally, if people are building these connections and having these conversations, searching on a search engine is part of that conversation, internal dialogue is that conversation, sitting on an ebook reader is part of that conversation, but also sitting in Microsoft Word is part of that conversation. So imagine now not only pushing out to Google where it gets heat maps and pulling in those resources, but imagine now that as you're typing your next term paper, you've added into Microsoft Word, as you're typing along, it's going ahead, pulling out nice little meaty keywords and populating it dynamically as well. And so now what happens is, once again, the user can go and say, nope, I like that one, give me more like that. Suddenly we get more resources. And there's the one I want. I'm going to drag it in, automatically create the citation because they're smart objects. And that's delightful. The other thing, though, that we know is that already a really interesting interface has been set up, which is we've learned now that red lines are how we do spell checking. And for those of us who go back way too far, that's, took us a while to get over not having to go spell check and go one by one. Well, imagine now having a credibility check so that as certain terms get highlighted, instead of clicking for a new definition, you could bring up and click and say, well, here are some potential credible sources regarding Spain in that context. And so now here's some websites and books and articles that may be pulled, and we can go ahead and directly embed them there as well. So my point of all of this, the goal of this project is to make as easy to find credible information in the digital age, and really it's to make it as easy to embed credibility into the web as it currently is to do maps and ads and videos. Right? Imagine now when you're on a YouTube video, you capture the embed code, you throw it in. Well, imagine that you have a standing credibility search, or you're blogging, or as you're blogging, it's bringing up potential resources you can begin to embed. So rather than the current approach to credibility, which is here's a checklist, make sure it matches this checklist, which turns out are great formulas for how to make credible looking websites with bad information in them. Now we're actually talking about building tools and using semantic web. And the important part is having theory to guide us that doesn't simply describe what's happening, but talks about, gives you this ideal future, which is if it's about conversations, now we can not simply describe what's there and what the trends are going to look like. We can begin to say, well, wait, when you look at theory, theory takes you this way. So briefly, when I mentioned yesterday about hubris and wanting to take on the entire librarianship, why do I say things like librarians shouldn't be artifact-centric? Because when you go back to theory about how people learn, artifacts are secondary to what they learn. First of all, they have it in their head. They forget what artifact is. That they learn through conversation. So if librarians are in the knowledge business, that means they need to be in the conversation business, not the thing and artifact business. And that makes things look really different. So for example, instead of music reading rooms looking like stacks and stacks of CDs you can pull out, they should look like 2 grand pianos on a stage. Because when people are going in to get, musicians are going to get music,
their language is actually playing to each other. And, oh, did you try this? Or instead of humming it in their head, they can actually try it. And how do you engage with dialogue in those conversations? We pulled together a group of business leaders. We're working with the Free Public Library in Philadelphia. And we said, all right, how can the public library better serve you as CEOs, CIOs, and corporations? And they said, it can't. We don't care. We don't use the public library. We have our own. They said, but when I was starting my business, I was in the public library all along. I couldn't use my corporate resources because there was a conflict of interest. I didn't want them to know what's going on. And there was no other place that had these multi-million-dollar databases except the public library. And so we started talking about, what does public library service look like for entrepreneurs? And the answer wasn't, give me more books on, Dummy's Guide to Starting a Hair Salon. It was, I need a place to work, I need a computer to store it on that's a secure third space. I'm a mother, I need daycare so that I can have someone watch my kid while I'm starting this business. I need an angel network. I need access to venture capitalists. I need access to lawyers and accountants. And I need to take field trips to successful startup businesses. So what a library looks like in entrepreneurship is not a bunch of books on entrepreneurship. It's a startup. It's an incubator space.
I just have one more question. I think obviously pretty cool. Now I'm taking this course this summer in digital libraries, and it makes me think that creating these, let's just say it's a hard-coded digital library.
Yeah.
Rather than ever having to do that, we should be able to use this type of thing to create digital libraries on the fly that don't exist anywhere on the web, but we just, okay, I need a digital library right now that deals with local history.
Right.
And I should be able to, on the fly, pull all that stuff together in a place,
Right.
keep it for as long as I want, and not care where it is. I shouldn't have to house it in my digital library.
Right. The holy grail for digital libraries for a long time was user-generated content, right? Which today sounds almost quaint. They were wondering, why do I put up all this beautiful, wonderful content, and why aren't teachers leaving lesson plans, and why aren't chemists leaving, And meanwhile, and they say, oh, people are too lazy. I swear to God, that was the big dialogue in digital libraries. People just want their information, they're good enough, and they don't do anything. And then Wikipedia came along, and then Flickr came along, and then YouTube came along, and they went, wait, they're leaving it there? What's going on? And the answer, actually, I thought was well put by Tim Spalding of Library Thing. He said, why do people tag like crazy in Library Thing, but when you go to Amazon, they won't tag at all? And the answer was, for him, and this is, to be empirically tested would be interesting. He said, because in Library Thing, it's your collection. And Library Thing is a website where you can upload all your books and sort of organize them, find other people reading your kind of book. So it's your collection of books that are up there. You can use it actually like your own sort of card catalog. In Amazon, they're asking you to come in and organize their shelves. This idea of ownership. Why I personally hate WebCT, which you guys spent time with yesterday. It's someone's model of education. Did you notice it? The education is you talk about stuff and you read stuff. Right? So you have bulletin boards for talking about stuff, and then you have pages to post stuff. But they're connected. I want to talk about that stuff. I want to bring these things in. The idea is that we need to build dialogues. And so what this sort of underlying theory, this conversation theory says, is that there is a pressure for participation. People participate. People are social. Not out of some sense of altruism, but actually a sense of sort of selfishness. The reason that Facebook works is because I can go into Facebook and I can shape it around me. And in fact, the reason I'm getting more and more pissed off at Facebook is they're restricting my ability to do that. But if you look at the explosion of app markets, right, so what am I doing with this? While people are going to talk about the walled gardens of Apple, the truth is that the apps that I have on my thing, I picked. So what I'm doing is I'm literally shaping my telecommunication experience around me. And now when I encounter a technology that doesn't let me do this, I get annoyed. And in fact, you see a subset of people that get annoyed with Apple, so they jailbreak it, or they go get droids, or they get rid of their Apple, because they don't have that ability. Same thing, when you guys come into this program, and you go, this is a stupid class, right? You want to get up and say, change this class. Now, when you're in a limited marketplace, good luck finding another one, we can discard you. But when you're a really choked marketplace, the more you can accommodate the pressure for participation, the better. Libraries are finding this because they go to the catalog. They put in something they want to know about, and what does it do? It
spits out a bunch of stuff. What if you say you're missing a piece? I'm going to upload it. Can you do that? No, this is the library's collection. But if you're facilitating a conversation, and school libraries are actually where you see this action going on 100%. You mentioned the idea of organizing your books not by doing. We're radical, right? But the other thing is that your kids come in and produce materials and produce things, and those go into the collection. And that's what we're starting to see is the idea of this pressure to participate. So Facebook and social media, whatever, it's not just a blip because it's current and trendy. It recognizes a fundamental human need to have a conversation and shape the conversation. Because a conversation, unlike this lecture, I apologize, is a two-way street. You have to stop and listen. You have to accommodate. You co-own that system, right? And so, yeah.
I would actually disagree with you that this is a one-way conversation. You just can't hear our dialogue that we're having with you.
Very good point. You're right. You're absolutely right. You are having a conversation. Right. I'm not facilitating a group-wide conversation yet. You're absolutely right. Thank you very much. So, but the point is, have you ever been in a class? I mean, if you take this to a certain stream, or any situation. Let's take a more universal situation. Have you ever been in that goddamn meeting where someone once said it's that meeting gave me that itch in the back of my neck that only a revolver will scratch. And you have the historian in the meeting. Yeah, the historian's the one that always, whenever you come up with an idea, will start with, well, what you've got to remember is in 1948. They are stifling the conversation. They're, in essence, not facilitating the conversation. They're shutting you down, right? And faculty will do that often. Well, that's great, but in my experience, in my research, and start talking about statistics and everything to shut you up, right? Right, yeah. And so, and education, the sage on the stage, the guide on the side, right? We're trying to become more facilitated. Librarians, instead of walking up to the librarian and them just starting throwing stuff at you, we want them to sort of help you develop that. And now with businesses are like, look, if you want me to use Barnes & Noble, I got to see myself in there somehow, right? And so I don't like your search engine. I'm going to mash it up. So suddenly this whole notion of social network doesn't become a trend and cool thing. It becomes I understand where it comes from now. So why should a library be on Facebook? Well, should they? Yes. How? By putting their search box to a catalog on it? Absolutely not. Because it's a conversation. How do they facilitate it? The search box is just a tool that can be part of it. So that's what my point here is, when you're working on it, we're going to be teaching you and stressing this a lot. Your methods courses, your statistics courses, all going to be pushing you towards empirical description. It's theory that lets you move here. It's theory and ideas that help you intellectually move up here to know what's next. And sometimes the theory will follow what you have in your mind, your passion. And the point is to have an impact. The point is to go back and change the world and not simply describe the world. And that's something that's hard to teach, but it's something that's absolutely essential to becoming true scholars. So, questions, comments, where did I get that wrong? What else? Is it early?
I was chuckling when you said you're in one of those meetings, because my way of getting out of that meeting is to, in my own mind, is I'll write notes forward that are important. I'll write notes to myself backwards, because I can write perfectly well backwards in script. I'll write notes to myself backwards with dialogue in my mind that has to get out or I'll say it. I can't believe this guy's talking again. But no one else can read it, because they look up at my paper and they can see the normal notes. So I got 2 lines forward, 1 backward, and someone looked at me like,
what are you doing, Da Vinci?
once I look to the right, you can actually read it. But it's just funny because you're right, you're in those meetings and you just want to escape.
Well, and that dialogue, once again, you're absolutely right. That dialogue is occurring, and the question is, within the context you're in, how much of a control do you need to be, and how much frustration are you going to generate if you're not? Because
when you talk about the theory that's going to push you up, if we could talk about a little about, or if anybody has anything to add about identifying that theory or finding, because for us, we're actually fairly lucky. Sarah and I both have a pretty concrete theory that we're going to use in terms of the lens that we're going to look at our research questions through. Pat and Joanne, I think, are a little farther out,
Shopping.
maybe, but getting closer.
Right, shopping.
So, yeah, so the thing, and this came up early because I just happened to stumble across mine through looking at other theories, but it came up in especially our first research design, I guess if you will, class, is that sometimes that's the hardest part, that especially the PhD students were like, oh, you found a theory, or it may take some time, and I didn't know if you could talk a little bit about
Sure.
how that comes about, or.
Theories are like standards. They're great because there's so many to choose from. And in the social sciences, in library science is one that's been called an atheoretical field. And I actually agree that it's an atheoretical field because, once again, it's a sort of artificial construct, not theoretically driven. But as the good news is that we don't have the predominant field, right? If we're in physics and you don't speak string theory, why are you here? Right? In fact, it's very hard to get away from a dominant theory. Management has the TAM model for how people do technology adoption and such.
Yeah.
And so I actually don't mind the fact that we're in a freer environment, but the problem becomes finding the
Or
right
the
one.
benefit because
Right.
of the interdisciplinary
Right.
nature of it and
Right.
how it can be.
And I think the answer to me is, it's like that credibility thing. It's got to make sense to you when you find it. I think it's got to help you be predictive and not simply descriptive. That was my mistake with the first go round, is that I used the theory that I thought I was using in a way that would help me predict things, and it turns out when I look back, it helped me describe it. I think that you find it from reading and finding things that make sense. It's kind of like credibility. You sort of agree with it before you find it. There's also a very interesting dialogue that goes on, and you will encounter some of that here, which is informally there's the division between big T theory and little t theory. Big T theory are theories that sort of are very broad, very universal. Relativity, evolution. And there aren't any hard lines. I would consider complexity theory and conversation theory to be big T theories. They don't help you solve that problem, but they give you lots of room to move it. Todd Marshall will tell you that it's actually an epistemology. Little T theory are things that solve really finite problems. So if you're in information retrieval, you will be surrounded by little T theory. In management, you're surrounded by little T theory, which is something that helps you explain how people make decisions in the aeronautical industry manufacturing division, right? And it may be extremely well suited for that and be very descriptive and be completely useless in helping you move outside of that domain. So I push people to find as big a T theory as they're comfortable with. But the way you find them is you find them by, I think, first having a sense of the world, finding articles and things that you think make sense, and then that gives you the opportunity to jump into the theory they use. So Michelle was talking about before, part of what you guys are going to be doing by reading those articles are sort of getting acquainted with some theories that we've found before. Conversation theory, I hate to say it, well, I'm just going to say it. I found conversation theory by saying, knowledge is created through conversation, throwing that into Google, and it came up with the Wikipedia entry on conversation theory. And then reading the damn book that was that thing.
Right.
And conversation theory, the other thing you're going to find with theory is, do you want to use it as informing? So complexity theory was very much an informing theory, which means if I met John Holland, who developed the complex adaptive theory system, and walked to him, I really couldn't have a discussion about what he should change. I'm just sort of learning, listening, and using. As opposed to true theory work, which is, wait, I went and tried it, and I found that you missed it by this, and we need to adjust the theory. And so conversation theory is one of those things that we've had to really update, because it was written in the 70s out of cybernetics, and it was written in the time of mechanical programming of machines. And a lot of the stuff that Pask, who developed it, wrote, we take for granted today. I mean, he had a whole chapter on how, when you do an experiment, the experiment itself can influence the person taking the experiment. Today we go, well, yeah. But in a positivist tradition, that was very weird. So we had to update it with dialectic theories and other theories to break it off. But I think so the short answer is having a general sense, reading and finding a connection, and then that drives you down further in the literature. No.
I had a serious one too, or a more serious note. When you're showing this ideal system that's going to grab this information, whether you're in Word or something else moving over it, what pops up in my mind is how amazing this would be in a corporate environment with an ERP system to be looking for information information about whatever division, whatever sales, whatever product, and be able to just right-click on that and see the information that's linked with it.
We've been talking with the
That's
publishing.
where I see this, like,
Yeah.
holy cow.
Well,
We already have that, I mean, there's a lot of systems that do that already,
Yeah, we
whether or
use
not
it.
it's implemented well, but.
Drill down data warehousing?
Well, no, you have drilled, that's not what I'm talking,
Right.
I'm
But it's the
talking about,
connections.
it's a bigger connection across ERP systems.
One of the things that we looked at knowledge management world was the old knowledge management system that we all had to live through at some point was, all right, write up your entire life in an article and post it to the knowledge management system. And then it would sit and die there because no one knew that it even existed. It was only in solving problems that you could actually figure out how to customize it to what you need. And once again, when I look at that using this big hammer of a theory here, I sit there, you generated artifacts, and you needed to generate that mesh of connections, and the topologies underneath. And so I think it had, we even looked in the scholarly publishing and publishing industry for the idea as the scientist goes through, and they may find that an article takes them, they're in information science and suddenly they're reading archaeology papers. That doesn't fit in their way of classifying it, but it makes sense when you follow the connections of this led to this. So actually citation data is much more interesting for organizing materials than topic or title.
True.
So,
I haven't thought this through thoroughly, but is there an element of like moral hazard or unintended consequences that go along with this? In terms, something as dynamic
Yep,
as
yep,
this is just way out there. But on another note, do you teach a class in presentation? That's awesome. That you put out there.
no, this is my frustrated background in Bachelor of Fine Arts I'm coming now.
Okay.
And it's you gotta use Keynote on the Apple because then if you have nothing to say, at least it's pretty. I did one on screencasting, talk about it together. The moral hazard's an interesting question. And that's why one of the things, so when we were looking in the world of, MacArthur started looking at credibility online, and they said, here's the problem. The world is digital, we don't know what to trust, go figure it out. Now you break those assumptions down, it's like, well, did we ever know what to trust? And then there's all things about, is the world truly digital? But anyway, you go down that line, and the first reactions to credibility online are, one, it's an impossible problem, right? Because then what you get is you quickly jump into what is truth, and then you're having philosophical debates about, is there an objective reality in the universe, and it's a spiral. The other one is, all right, we need a tool quick, and the tools almost always come in the form of checklists. Trust this source, trust that source. What I call an authoritarian notion of credibility, which means you go to an authority source. So if it came from a library, it's true. If it came from a .gov, we all know it's perfectly true and always good, right? And we can't trust that it's .gov, but at .edu, you've seen these in the school library, right? You give it to a kid, and it says .gov, .edu, trust, .com, down. Now the truth is, having set up a few .edu sites and a few .gov sites, it might, right? So you got to move past that, and then we came to the point of, all right, what truly is credibility? Is the credibility lie here, or does the credibility lie here, right? And so that was a big adjustment. So in literature, you'll find lots of people talking about what's called source credibility. This is where you'll see study after study of people think that newspapers are more trustworthy than TV news is more trustworthy than whatever, right? So you got to begin to say, well, wait, I make a credibility determination. So I don't know if you've ever had this. I had when I was in my doctoral program, Mary McKenna, of no relation, I think, was in the doctoral program with me. And whenever I wanted to see a movie, I'd always ask her what movie to see. And the reason was because whatever new movie she told me to see, I would not like, and vice versa. So we'd always get each other's movie suggestions because we could predictably and reliably know that they would be completely opposite of what we'd see. So that's a sense of credibility. There's some interesting studies looking, for example, after Hurricane Katrina, the NOLA.com, which was the New Orleans newspaper's website, suddenly took all their big discussion boards and set them up by district, set them up by neighborhoods. And suddenly what happened is these conversations where information they were getting from FEMA and the government weren't true, people, they were all getting frustrated because they didn't know who to trust. And what happened was one person would get the answer. And they would all try it, and they would all now make that person the expert. And then within a month, that was the authoritative source was the person who over time gave you a predictable, reliable answer. So what we started thinking about was, how can we take that
new model, which is what I call a reliability model of credibility, which means performance over time or agreement over multiple sources, and operationalize it. And only when I began to look at the theories, looking at conversation theory, to say credibility comes from these conversations, comes from agreements. It comes from, I'm going to agree that for this topic, you're a source, this one you're not. And so that builds a structure. So we start with librarians as this big block. But frankly, it's a big block. Having trained librarians, it's not a uniform group. What we want to get is build an architecture so it literally is, I'm going to trust you and you and you. Right? So you see this on Twitter all the time. The people you subscribe to their feeds, they're sending you links. Those are the links you look at as opposed to the big generic ones. Oh, we'll go down the line. All right, sorry.
I think the other thing to be aware of credibility is a lot of times the first person to the table automatically becomes the most credible.
Mhm.
Like, if they do a lot of competitive analysis in the interactive industry, like, a lot of times the person that just did it first, like, if I have to hear one more bit about Home Depot's faceted math, I'll put my eyes out. Like, it's good,
Right.
it's good, but they were just the first person
Right.
to do it.
And that's the link to my unintended consequence.
Yeah, there's absolutely, and what we were looking at is the Google bombing phenomenon, which is the people learned really easily that they could Google bomb. All the bloggers would point to something with one term and they could adjust the rankings. We thought, well, if you take one step back and you put a sort of trusted intermediary, so in this case librarians, pointing to those resources, it takes away that problem, not all problems, but that problem. And then the question becomes, if you begin to build personalized networks of credibility, you begin to narrow it down. So, but good point.
To use your term, I think I'm suffering from source amnesia right now.
Yes.
But I know there's a lot of work on trust and reputation systems, and that is responsible for the success of eBay, for example, where people develop reputations online and even Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Now, it may have a bad name among librarians,
Not at all.
but the trust is growing online and
Yes.
you can build it using those kind of reputations.
And they're based on a different model than who they were. It became their performance over time within them. So in eBay, it was they got ranked multiple times as highly successful. In Wikipedia, they became reliable because they're at its stayed. And the idea being that credibility, instead of being something that is one inherent in the object and intransient, became, when you look at it with the theory, it becomes a condition that's built up over time through multiple interactions, through conversations. Now those conversations, once again, could be very anemic, looking at stars, but there's still the idea of interpretation. The other thing, though, when you move to this, so one of the articles I think you're going to read, if you're going to read it from me, is one I did JDoc about this, but so you'll hear it all again. Moving from authority, which means who said it, to reliability, how many people said it, or that person was right multiple times. The downside of that reliability model is if you screw up once, it comes really hard. So we have examples like Oprah managed to recover from the James Fry incident. New York Times mostly recovered from the Blair incident, but others, Bush never recovered from the "you're doing a good job" Brownie stuff. I mean, so it becomes a much more dynamic world of credibility and that's why we're looking at search as opposed to the big list and the big whatever. Though we imagine, for example, over time, the reason we're tying to librarians is they're doing this reference every day. And so what's going to happen is a decay factor. So after 3 months, you begin to depreciate what links they came up with because stuff might have moved on.
I know two good things. When I was doing a lot of programming, I think one area that was starting to get it right was you could have a programming issue you were dealing with, and you would submit it, and it had .NET sites where you had programmers who would answer other programmers' questions, and then the next programmer would improve it, and then you would rate the answers from these different programmers. And they started just bubbling to the top. People who were always able to help you solve a problem.
Right.
And it wasn't just about just being right. It was about giving an answer, somebody else building on that answer, making it better, and then suddenly that solution became the top solution.
Right.
And so it was a great model in a smaller environment, sort of for a smaller task of what you want to see more globally.
Building credible communities. Right.
And then the other thing, you started out this whole thing with, starting with the questions.
Yep.
So when these experts then they are finding the reliable sources, those reliable sources. But to me, even having this database for this a huge FAQ site,
Yep.
what are the questions that were being asked?
Yep.
Because knowing the questions is to me huge.
It is, and it gives you a lot of interesting data, right? So rather than dealing with just this link goes to this, we have the question, we have the answer, and we have what's very interesting, which is conversation theory helps, but in general, you have a sequence, which is, in conversations have sequences. And we know from studies looking at transcripts of question answering that you might think, well, the first one's the question and the last one's the answer. And rarely is that the case. The first one's almost always a hi, how you doing, building a relationship. The last one's almost always a thank you or finishing that relationship. So, and we know that questions often morph, right? And particularly in programming. Why isn't this thing compiling? You find out eventually that it had nothing to do with, what you wrote. It was some subroutine 12 times removed. So, yeah, that's right. User error. Please replace user. And this is, by the way, one last comment. You're going to hear a lot about the user in this group, and I wish Christina was here. I think there's an over-obsession at the user, and the reason comes from theory, which is, am I a user, I'll go back to that iPhone example. Am I a user of the iPhone? I have a different relationship than just using it, because I also help shape it. And so, in some ways, I invest in this thing. And so, we need to recognize that there's a much more complex relationship than consumer-seller. That there's a relationship that's built, that there's loyalty that's built, that there's ownership that's invested in both sides, that needs to be recognized in both sides. In the federal government, we have citizens. Citizens are not the same as consumers. They paid for it in some way. Now, they may not care about it generally, but they have an investment. So, and I don't say that universally and all that, but I would just warn you that as you keep hearing the user, take that with a bit of a nuance and start saying, all right, but they also are a participant. They participate in this system. They help shape this system. So, yes?
So you could use your conversational theory for, say, if I was an organization and I was a supply chain manager, and I'm trying to establish that relationship with these individuals or these individual companies on supplies that I need to produce my particular product.
Yeah. And because
that trust factor, could you use that? Use that.
The conversation theory doesn't talk directly to issues in trust and credibility. I think it affects it. But one of the things that's useful to think about is, if you come up with a contract, the contract is an artifact, but it represents the agreements that you came up with. But conversation theory also begins to talk about levels of language. And so, for example, there's L0 and L1. L0 is when you start having a conversation, you always start at L0, which is a negotiation language. Like, what terms are we going to agree on? Are we going to speak this language? Who's going to go first? Is there a power relationship involved in this? And then L1 is when you get to the actual content. So the example is in library land, I can say something to the effect of, we used Mark to enhance the retrieval of the catalog. Now, someone outside of the library world might be saying, who's Mark and why did they need to find a sweater out of a catalog? And the librarians are sitting there going, oh, that's a Mark record, and that's a catalog, it's an inventory system, etc. And so one of the failures that you often see in this negotiation is a complete ignorance of the language being exchanged. And the other thing is that these agreements that people build are unique to them. So even though we say we agree, your worldview, what you take away from this and what I intended you to take away from this, two different things, very different things. And I can continue to engage you in conversations to try and get you closer to what I want. But you have to be willing to go there, right? You have to, I'm not buying that. I'm not. The most important agreement is agreeing not to agree. To know when you can simply say, we can't move on this topic. Does that stop the rest of the conversation? Or does that mean that we're just going to put this one off? So, for example, defending thesis, you guys will love this part. When you defend your thesis, because I assume it's like how the doctoral students do it, it starts with a meeting of the committee where you're not present. And the question to that committee is, should we continue? Is this document ready to defend? And I have been part of one, and only one, where the answer was no. We cannot even have this conversation. We're not ready to have this defense. And so, having that agreement to say, we cannot agree, it stops the conversation, or we cannot agree, let's talk about other parts of it, come back to it, or things like that. But recognizing it's a process, recognizing you're building agreements, recognizing it's uniquely human, and recognizing that no matter what documents you produce, they will always be a very pale ember to what you actually keep in your head. It's very important. Because there are many documentalists around who feel that documenting things solves problems. And the answer is, not really. So, they're useful. Artifacts are useful, but they are secondary to what's going on up here.
I guess a practical question
Yeah.
in regard to what you just said, because I think it's very important. If we're collaborative and if we're working with our advisors and
Yes.
our committees, how could you possibly get to the point that you're ready for yours and not have had that committee and people looking at this and directing you all along? So at the point where you are to defend, to me, it should be almost a no-brainer because everyone has seen your work, they've already given you direction, they've seen your advice work. How does that happen? I'm asking this theoretically.
No, the answer, you are absolutely right that in when it works the way it should work, you never get to that point.
Okay.
When it works, when a doctoral student simply does not want to listen, or hears a different thing than you are saying, ultimately they can schedule a meeting. When you guys scheduled the meeting, I don't know if you saw that, but you guys scheduled this meeting for the defense. You should do it with your advisor. But there have been situations where students have simply said, and frankly, sometimes advisors are distracted and bad things like that. But the short answer is it should never happen that way. And in some other schools where there's a much bigger disconnect between advisor, it's happened. It should in this program never happen. And the only time it would ever happen is if you have an absentee advisor, which is evil, or if you have a student who simply doesn't, says, well, they said it needed work, but I thought I did the work, right? Yeah, right.
The old question, RTFP. Freaking problem.
Oh, yeah.
So the thing is, follow up, if you think you did the work, ensure you did the work, don't schedule anything.
You have to have your advisor sit there and go, yes.
Yes, right, okay.
Even then, you might have someone on the other thing is, this is not going to be a minor document you're putting together, right? So, it is possible, though very rare to happen, that somewhere on page 92, you wrote something that is a fundamental thing that you never really got to, because you're balancing all this stuff with your advisor, or you're working with me, and somewhere within your statistics, there's a problem, because I wouldn't find it. But Jeff's on your committee, and Jeff's going to come in and go, I just saw this 2 weeks ago. This is a problem. That's why you're hearing lots of work with your committee, and not just necessarily your advisor, and talk with your committee. Because you're right. In the way it should work is by the time you sit down, you're done. And it's a nice conversation, and yes, there are things that may change, but you've already got payoff that they're going to proceed with this. We were just in a situation where it was a bad confluence of events. And the answer was, we love you, and it'll be great, but not today. It's just not enough here today. And that was, oh man, that was tough for both sides. And we have lunch, right? So, thank you.
Thank you.